Hello. In this video, I'll be covering the subject of perspective in street scenes. If you have had any trouble drawing buildings, cars and figures in perspective, then please watch this video to the end, as I'm sure it will be of help. When we talk about perspective, there are two terms you need to be familiar with. One is linear perspective, which is the main subject of this video, and linear perspective is a way of creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface. It has to do with lines. There's also aerial perspective, which deals with the effect of atmosphere on objects as they move further away or closer to the viewer. In this video, I'm primarily dealing with linear perspective, and in the future I'll produce a video on aerial perspective. The tips I give in this video are focused on how they apply to street scenes. However, much of the information applies equally to landscapes and seascapes. When painting a street scene, the first line I place on the paper is eye level. The reason for this is because it allows me to draw everything else relative to this line. Eye level is the height of the viewer's eye above the ground. Think of this as the person taking the photo. People sitting down would see things differently than those standing because their eyes are lower to the ground. Eye level is the same as a horizon line. At the beach, the horizon is very easy to see. However, in a city environment, the horizon is not always viewable because of the buildings and other obstructions. Hence, it's easier to think of eye level instead. The importance of eye level is that because of perspective, everything moving away from the viewer and which is above eye level will appear to be moving down towards eye level. On the other hand, everything below eye level and moving away from the viewer will appear to be moving up towards eye level. Things at around eye level, such as people's heads, will not look like they're moving up or down, though the figures' bodies will look smaller as they move into the distance. Every book on perspective talks about vanishing points. This is where parallel lines of objects, which are moving away from the viewer, appear to be vanishing at some point in the distance. These objects could be telegraph poles, roadways, buildings, rows of windows, train lines or trains. The vanishing point in a flat scene, such as a train station, is always somewhere on eye level. This will give a drawing a sense of depth when done correctly. You can see a good example of the vanishing point in the photo on the screen. Most people's heads are around eye level, though if someone is taller than the viewer, then their head will be above eye level, while if they are shorter, the head is below. Here are some generalized measurements you can use when drawing up a typical street scene. Doorways are taller than the person standing next to them. Awnings are roughly twice a person's height. And typically cars are a little bit below head height. Obviously, these guidelines are just that, because in real life, not all buildings are built to the same specifications. Cars are not all the same size, and people are taller or shorter than one another. However, these guidelines will help you to pick out the key measurements in your reference photo or from the scene in front of you if you are painting or drawing from life. Another point when drawing a street scene is to make sure your buildings do not lean. They only have a lean if they are falling or have something wrong with them, such as in Venice or Pisa. I keep my drawings quite loose because that's the style I like to paint in. So on the screen at the moment, we have a photograph of a location in Melbourne, Victoria in Australia. I've selected it because it's a relatively simple scene. It's a mostly flat road, and for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume it's flat all the way. In the distance, we've got the central business district, and this is just one of the streets leading up to that. If I'm happy with the reference, meaning I want to draw it from the viewpoint of this photograph, Remember, as an artist, we don't have to stick with what's in the photo. But in this case, in the main, I'm going to be using this photo as the reference. I'll move some cars around and adjust some figures, but beyond that, we're going to be painting this scene. So the first thing I've got to do is work out eye level, because that's the first line I want to put in. And remember, as I mentioned before, you determine eye level by looking at lines that move away from you, and where they intersect, that intersection point is eye level. So in a scene like this, if I look at the top of this awning, for instance, and if I just extend that line down and then pick a line below eye level like the road is, and then we'll draw that line up, and where they intersect is the vanishing point. So that is our eye level. So here, if we look at the drawing, there's eye level. That's step number one. From the reference, I was able to determine where the vanishing point is, so I've marked that. And then from the vanishing point, I create radial lines that move out from that. And these lines will help me with my drawing. Generally, I would use a pencil and very lightly mark these in. I don't normally use a ruler because, again, I paint in a fairly loose fashion, but if it's easier for you when you're first starting, use a ruler by all means. But don't press very hard, because most of these lines you'll want to get rid of later. Once I've established the vanishing point and drawn in some of these radial lines, I next put in a figure. The key thing about the figure is if they're standing, and if the reference was, the reference photo was taken while the person was standing, then the figures within the scene are all going to have their heads roughly around eye level. So there's eye level, and I have some figures with some heads above eye level, some on eye level. I might even have some a little bit below eye level. But generally, their heads are going to be around eye level. And as they move further away, their heads will still stay at eye level, but they'll be a little bit smaller, and the bodies will get smaller. So these figures over here are on the other side of a very wide street. So they're much further away than these figures here, so they appear much smaller than these figures, but their heads are still around eye level. What I can do now is I can look at my figure and say, okay, at this point, if this is the distance from the person's foot to eye level, if I double that, where that line meets, which is there, meets another line or an imaginary line, so if I didn't have a line there already drawn up, I would then draw another line through that corner and that would give us the bottom front edge of the awning. I can then, generally all I do is I just look at my photo and estimate how big the awning is at this point, near the edge of my reference, and that gives me the front of the awning. I'll get rid of this line here now. And then I look at my photo and I roughly estimate how wide the bottom of the awning is at this position, and then I'll connect that to this corner with a horizontal line. I can then take another line from the foot of this reference figure, bring it in, and then if I drop a line down and where they meet, that gives me the corner of where the walls of the building meet the footpath. So now we've got the footpath here, and we've got our awning under here. So already our scene is starting to develop some structure. I'm not going to draw the individual cars as they appear in my reference. Again, that's too much detail. To me, cars are abstract shapes that break up the roadway into a more interesting pattern. So generally what I do is I start by drawing squares, and within those squares I will draw cars, and I'll go through that process with you. This car here is going to be roughly at about shoulder height for the people within the scene. And then I place other squares within my painting where I will place cars. At this stage, all I'm interested in is creating an interesting pattern of these squares as abstract shapes. Obviously, as they move further in the distance, the squares are going to be smaller. The tops of the squares is going to be closer and closer to eye level, because the cars as they're moving away will appear to be getting closer and closer to eye level. It's not always easily observable, because even in this reference, the roadway is not totally flat. It's actually dipping down a bit and then dips up a bit. But if this was a totally flat road, these cars as they move further away, assuming they're the same type of car, their roof would appear to be getting closer and closer to eye level. Okay. So right now they're just abstract shapes. In here I'm going to draw what could be a bus or a tram, and this is one time when, rather than just drawing a square, I draw a box, because it will be easier for me to fit a tram in there, whereas a car is much shorter and it works better in a square like this. Now at this point I could either finish putting in the cars and then put in the rest of the building, or I can do the building and then come back and do the cars. It doesn't really matter which one you do next. Here at this stage I've put in the windows. Again, I just estimate roughly how far beneath the awning are the tops of the windows, and I pick a height and then extend that line to the vanishing point, and that will be the top of my windows. Obviously some windows are taller than others, but for this reference, this painting, I just make them all the same height. And then this is where my footpath meets the wall, and if I'm drawing a doorway, I'll bring the doorway below the top of the windows. Again, that's just for my reference. You can have taller and shorter doorways, but I extend the doorway all the way down to the ground, and if I've got other doorways, I can extend that line and draw another doorway if I want. Most of what you see back here is going to be very loosely painted, so I don't need to put in any more detail than I have there. I go in and put in some of the other objects. Here's your telegraph poles, and you can see how as they move further into the distance, they're going to appear smaller and smaller, moving down towards the vanishing point, except for their bases, which will move up towards the vanishing point. The same with the edge of the roadway here. And you'd be surprised how often people paint this wall above the awning. They make it much, much bigger than what it is. If you look at the reference, you'll see how this shape is actually quite small relative to this shape because of where we're standing. Okay. On the other side of the road, where you can get a more front-on view of the building, you can see how the top part of the building above the awning is much bigger than down below. So just watch that. A lot of people get that wrong. In the foreground, I've drawn more detail than the distance. These buildings are a long way away, and frankly you can't even see windows or anything like that in them because they're just so far away. And even if I could see them, in my painting I wouldn't put them in because I want to help add even more depth to the painting, which is as a result of the atmosphere reducing the amount of detail you can see. So what I can do within those boxes then is draw in my car, and I just use approximate proportions. Every car is different, they have different dimensions. I'm painting a street scene where I'm trying to capture the feeling of the scene rather than capturing the detail of the cars. So the cars for me are very generic. In Australia we drive on the left hand side of the road, so these cars here are all moving away from us. The tram and this car are moving towards us. So if I'm drawing the back of the car, I come down a little bit more than a third and draw a line, come down a little bit further, draw another line, and then come down probably about a quarter of the distance, draw a line, and that'll be the bottom of the back of the car, and then the rest of the space is where the wheels will fit. These are very loose guidelines. A good tool, if you're not comfortable drawing cars, is you can pick up a toy car like this, or raid your grandchild or your daughter or son's toy collection, and they're very useful to help you visualize how to draw a car. You can also go out and observe these on the street. However, that can be a bit dangerous if you're trying to draw a moving car from the front, for instance. But so a toy like this, there's some key things to keep in mind. So this is drawing the car from behind. There's the windscreen. There's a small space there. If I colour that in, then you're going to draw the back of the car there, and then you've got the wheels. At the back, you won't see the front grille. You're just going to have the lights on either side. As I said, my car is very simple. One thing I want to point out is this shape here. If you're directly behind the car or in front of the car, the windscreen, whether it be the front or the back one, this angle here will equal that angle there. But as it moves further away, so if I say it's on the other side of the road, can you see how this line now, let me get something a bit more straight, this line as it moves further away will start looking more vertical, like that, whereas this angle on this side becomes a steeper angle. The same would happen if I moved this over to here. You can't see it as much because I started this exercise here, but you can see how this line there is more vertical than that one there. Okay, so keep that in mind. If you draw it the other way, the car doesn't look right. Okay. Now I just use squares here as a rough guide. This Volkswagen Beetle fits in a square, so my dimensions are quite reasonable in terms of width versus height. But a lot of other cars are a lot flatter, so they might fit into a rectangle rather than a square. It really doesn't matter. If you want to concentrate on cars and in detail, then obviously the square idea isn't going to be that useful. But once I've drawn the square, I can go in and draw the rest of the car and give it a bit more shape. So, you know, draw in the windscreen, curve the windows down below, curve the bottom of the car. If the car's close enough, I'll put in mirrors, side mirrors, and maybe the tail lights. This car is directly in front of the viewer, so that's all you're going to see. As the car moves further to the side, you're going to see a little bit of the side here. You will also see these angles move. So you can see how this angle here, this line, is more vertical than that line there, okay? Car in the distance, that line is even more vertical, and that line is more angled, okay? So you have to keep that in mind. As it moves to the side of the viewer, you're going to start seeing some of the side of the car. And while you start with a square, now you have to make little adjustments. For instance, the side of the car that's furthest away from the viewer, in this case the rear of this car, some of that is going to stick out outside the square. This side will move into the square. But until the car moves a great distance away, you're only going to see a small part of the side of the car. The only time you'll see a lot of the side of the car, if it's close to you, is when it's turning, okay, or coming across an intersection. But this car here, it's even further away, so in this case, more of the car will stick out from the original square we drew. You know, the front right will stick out more towards the right, and you'll see more of the side of the car. So the squares were just to help you place the cars and to get the right level for the roof. The tram, however, is a different object because it's very long, and in this case, the top of the tram and the bottom of the tram in themselves are lines moving away from eye level, and they will be, if you extend those lines, you will find that they will meet up with your vanishing point, so you have to allow for that. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to just briefly mention that when you have an object like this side of the tram, those lines are actually moving away from us, but in this direction, and they will meet at another vanishing point. That vanishing point would be, if I drew it to scale, would be off our picture plane. So all I do is just make sure I slightly incline that down and incline the base up. The other thing to look at with the cars, if they're moving away from you, all you'll see is tail lights. But if they're moving towards you, you can put a grille in. If you have a Tesla, then that no longer applies. But for purposes of our exercise, I always put a grille in there. And the lights are different at the back than they are at the front. So I'll have red and amber lights back here, but I won't have red and amber lights at the front of the car. I just go in and finish up with some other details, wrap up the cars. Sometimes I'll draw a line underneath the cars to remind me to make sure that's a dark shadow underneath the car, and you know, a few very loose windows on the other side, and any other details here, hints at these chairs and this little side panel. And then once you get to this stage, you're ready to get into the painting.